Everyone for joining us this afternoon for this webinar on the principal obligations of FSMA for fully covered farms. My name is Kaylee and I'm the food safety specialist at CAF, and we'll also be joined by Dave Runstead, the policy director at CAF. We're going to go over a couple logistical details of using this GoToWebinar software. If you are accessing this webinar on the computer right now, you can see on the right-hand side there's this sidebar. If you click the little triangle next to questions, it expands down and you can type in a question and then send it just to us if you hit send privately, or you can send to all. And we will keep an eye on those questions, written questions, as we go. And if it's something that's relevant to clarifying what we're talking about in the moment, we'll talk about or answer the question then. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So this is slotted from 3:30 to 4:30 today, and we purposefully broke this content for fully covered farms up into 2 different webinars because it would be impossible to cover it all in 1 hour, and we wanted to make sure to give ample time for questions and for us to give examples as we explain it all. Okay, so that's the main important part of the GoToWebinar software, is to use that type in questions on the right-hand side. So first we want to thank our funder, which is through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and their Specialty Crop Block Grant program. We are able to provide this webinar and other technical support to small growers and family farmers across the state. And just a little recap, in case you didn't join us for the first webinar in this series on July 24th, there was this webinar that was an introduction to the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we talked about the types of food safety contamination on a farm, and then we talked about the types of farms that are within FSMA. So some farms in FSMA are fully exempt from the law. Some farms are what's called qualified exempt, so they have limited requirements, and then some farms are called covered farms, and those farms have to be in compliance with all of the requirements of FSMA. So here we are, the webinar is at this link on the bottom of the slide here, and it's free and publicly available on our website there. If you did not join us for that webinar, I would highly recommend going back and watching it, because your farm, what we say in this webinar for fully covered farms might not apply to you. So this is good knowledge just to learn in general, but figure out whether or not it really applies to you. And you can do that by watching the first webinar. So today we're going to talk about part 1 of principal obligations of fully covered farms, and then in the third webinar we will talk about part 2, and that will likely be later this winter, maybe December, January, about the second part of fully covered farms. We're also excited because we just released 2 short post-harvest videos on farm post-harvest food safety and different ways farms are setting up their post-harvest systems to reduce food safety risks and also have it be scale appropriate to their operation. And then we're working on releasing an updated farmer's guide and a series of fact sheets that look at the different topics within the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then lastly, just yesterday, we made some major updates to the workshop schedule on the website, so you can see if there's some in-person trainings in your area of the state, and we will be in a few more places in Southern California than we've been in the past, and also have a few different training options available in Spanish. Okay, so just to recap, if you didn't watch the first webinar and you're wondering what you missed, today we're going to be discussing farms that are fully subject to the produce rule. So in short, farms fall into this category if they, on average, during the last 3 years, have a rolling average of more than $500,000 in sales, and that's adjusted into 2011 dollars, or the farm sold less than $500,000 but did not sell at least 50.1% of their sales to a qualified end user. So this would be essentially sells directly to customers or through a CSA or a farmer's market or a farm stand or directly to one grocery store that turns around and puts it on the shelves at their grocery store or restaurant. If you're selling to a distributor or an aggregator, that wouldn't be sales to a qualified end user, or a wholesaler, that wouldn't be sales to a qualified end user. Okay. So fully covered farms under FSMA have a number of different topic areas where there are specifics underneath each. And today we're going to talk about worker training and qualifications, worker health and hygiene, buildings, equipment, tools, and sanitation, harvest and post-harvest activities, and record keeping. And the topics in red we'll discuss during the next webinar. And part of that is because we're waiting for more information from FDA on their decisions about water. They're reviewing the timeline and the number of tests required and a lot of other details. So we hope that by the next webinar we'll have more up-to-date information from them and can share that with you then. Okay, and then also just wanted to talk about, again, as we mentioned last time, that FSMA does not require fully covered farms to have a farm food safety plan, but CAF and a lot of other, UC Extension and other organizations do highly recommend that a farm develops a food safety plan, and these don't have to be that complex. It can be fairly simple. It just depends on the operation, and there's lots of templates out there that can help you, guide you in creating your plan. And then again, FSMA does not require require farms to have a third-party food safety audit. However, distributors and other buyers are required to verify their suppliers for the different FSMA rules that apply to them. So one way that a lot of buyers are verifying their growers is by asking them to show them their third-party food safety audit certificate. So we can talk more about that in the questions and answer time if people have specific scenarios around that. Okay, and then just another visual here, because this has actually slightly new information from the last time we talked about this in July. FSMA compliance dates are the same as in July, that the biggest farms need to be in compliance by 2018, by January 2018, and then 2019 and 2020, January, and both of those years for the smaller tiered financial levels there. However, this far column on the right that says inspections begin, the FDA announced in September that all states will not be doing any FSMA inspections for the biggest farms in 2018, even though they need to be in compliance in 2018. They're not going to start inspections until 2019. And that same timeline of things being pushed back a year is with the other size farms as well. And then also for the water compliance timeline, that also was extended, but that it will be dependent upon future FDA decisions later this fall and winter, that could change even more.
Yeah, so even though there won't be any inspections in 2018, if you caused an outbreak of some kind, made people sick, if you weren't in compliance, that would be held against you.
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, that's important to note. Don't think that just because they're pushing inspections back a year that you don't need to be ready. You still need to be ready. Okay, and then just a note on organic certification and the National Organic Program and the intersection of that and those regulations with the Food Safety Modernization Act. And there is some overlap between the two. If you are an organic farm, you're already taking a lot of records, and on top of a lot of the kind of tracking and documentation you need, you would just need to do a little bit more, actually quite a bit more, in worker training, health and hygiene, and then potentially the water category, but this is being reviewed. So this text here in the middle just is pulled from the law that the FSMA regulation does not require covered farms to take measures to exclude animals from growing areas or destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around growing areas or drainages. This is just good that it was put into the actual text of the law that you don't need to do anything in the name of food safety that would contradict what you're required to do for your organic regulations and certification. Okay, so now Dave and I are going to alternate here talking to you about different categories that fully covered farms will need to be ready to and implement the different changes on their farm, or if they're already doing it, make sure you're doing what the law says. So first, for worker training and qualifications, FSMA requires all farm personnel to be adequately trained upon hire and at least annually. Along with this, the farm personnel should have adequate training, education, and/or experience for their job duties. They want to make sure that you don't have somebody out leading the harvest crew that's never actually harvested themselves, or maintaining the packing shed and the barn and having all the product flow and doing those jobs when that person's never done that before. Normally all they do is do irrigation. So just making sure that job training is aligned with the tasks, and that also any training you give employees needs to be done in a way that's easily understood and in their native language. So farms need to consider that and make sure signage and training is provided in the native language of the employees. And then say you see, for number 4 here, you see a person or an employee on a farm that they come out of the restroom or the porta potty, and the hand washing station is on the outside of the porta potty, and they walk right by it and they don't wash their hands, and then they go pick up their harvest knife and go back to harvesting lettuce. That would obviously be a major problem. Failed and not washing your hands is a major risk for food safety and causing contamination of crops. So if that scenario was seen, you'd need to make sure to repeat training with that employee and document that you did that. And then also, we'll talk about this more in the record keeping section, but all training must be documented and include the names of those trained, the date of the training, and the topics covered. Okay, so all this training has to happen, and we just talked about that you need to write down what topics you train on and what are those topics. So if you have employees, all employees pretty much, even if they just work in the office, should be trained on basic food hygiene principles and food safety, the importance of personal hygiene and illness signs. For example, making sure people know the importance of hand washing, and if somebody has vomiting or diarrhea or a fever or any other illness symptoms, that they need to recognize that and not come to work or not work in a way that they would contaminate produce or food contact surfaces. And then also the trainings should be use the standards established by the FDA rule. So that's for everyone. And then anyone else that also harvests should be trained on a few other topics, and that is when to not harvest produce because it may be contaminated. For example, there's animal feces on the lettuce or right next to the lettuce, or there was flooding. You don't want to harvest a crop from a flooded area, things like that. And then also to not harvest dropped covered produce. Dave's going to talk more about that later, so we'll talk more about that then. And then also that employees know to inspect harvest containers and make sure they're clean and not a source of contamination. And what that means is something that's up to the farm and the business to decide. Obviously you want it to be clean and have the surface not filled with dirt and grime and decaying plant matter and things like that. But how often you clean and your cleaning method is not spelled out in the law. That's something you would decide at the farm. And then lastly, to correct problems during harvest or report them to a supervisor. So employees know that they are empowered, that they can correct a problem if they know how to and can in real time, and if they can't, to make sure to report it to a supervisor so things don't go on and not get addressed. One really new nationwide part of all of this is that at least one responsible party or supervisor from the farm must attend an FDA Approved Training. And currently there's only one of these being offered through the Produce Safety Alliance and by organizations that collaborate with this Produce Safety Alliance across the country. Usually there will be a fee for taking the training, and it's a one-time requirement, but the certificate for going to the training is attached to the person who went to the training, not the farm. So essentially, if your farm is fully covered, you need to make sure that at least one person goes to the PSA grower training course, and it's this URL here takes you directly to their homepage where they list the most recent and nationwide, actually it's worldwide, there's some trainings in other countries outside the US too. All the listings for upcoming trainings are posted there. And you would go to that training and then you get a certificate shortly thereafter for each person that goes to the training. So the owner might not necessarily go, but if they have a harvest foreman go and then he leaves and goes to another farm, and that was the only person from the farm who went to this training, then the farm would need to have a new person go to the training and get a certificate because the certificate leaves the farm and goes with the person. And this is a training that's, just to give you a little explanation about it, that's 8 hours of PowerPoint, and you receive a binder with all of the slides and additional material, and there's a lot of time for questions and answers, and it goes more in depth into essentially all the categories that we're going through in these 2 webinars.
Yeah, so tell them that the CDFA is going to finance a bunch of these at low cost.
So yes, thank you, Dave. Dave's just bringing up that CDFA, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, is going to be financing and subsidizing a lot of these courses throughout the state in the coming, in the near future, 3 years or so. So there's a wide range you'll see on this website here if you go to it. Some of these courses are $0 and some of the courses are hundreds of dollars. So if you have multiple options close to where you live, shop around, because there are some people that are using this as an opportunity as for business and consultants and things, and then there are others that are offered in conjunction with this CDFA program in one way or another that would be less costly. Okay, and just a visual to recap what we just talked about on the training requirements. So you make sure at least one supervisor or responsible party goes to this PSA training, and then that person would probably play a pretty key role in making sure the employees are trained on the farm at least once a year on all the applicable topics. And then, as was mentioned, you would have a record that each employee was trained and on what topics that is signed and dated. So that's the basics of worker training and qualifications. Now Dave is going to talk about worker health and hygiene.
Okay, so FSMA is essentially a preventive program, right? I mean, the reason it was created was this sense that the government was always coming after people got sick and trying to figure out why they got sick and, you know, what could be done about it. So they created this Food Safety Modernization Act with the idea that that we should try harder to prevent people from getting sick. And so one way that people get sick is from the workers being sick and handling the produce, or like in a restaurant, cooking your food when they're sick or something, or failing to go wash their hands and so forth. And so that's essentially what we're going to talk about here. Preventing sick workers from contaminating produce or food contact surfaces by taking 2 measures. One, the farm is supposed to exclude sick workers from any tasks or areas where they may contaminate the produce. So if somebody's sick, they don't necessarily have to go home, but they're not to be allowed to work with produce in a way that they could contaminate it. And then the second obligation of the farm is to train the workers to tell their supervisors if they or another worker have a health condition that might cause such contamination. But regardless of whether the worker reports being sick, and workers always want to work because they need the money, it's the employer's responsibility to exclude them from produce contact areas. Secondly, FSMA has a long list of things that workers are required to do. And this is going to be a real challenge for a lot of farms. Maintain personal cleanliness. That's a very subjective thing, but it's something to work with people about. Avoid contact with non-working animals. If somebody's going to work with animals and then they're going to work with produce, they're supposed to wear clothing that they maybe could take off after working with the animals. So, overalls or boots or gloves or whatever the case might be, that then, they could take off and then wash their hands and then go work with produce. So there has to be some consideration of, the order in which people do tasks on a farm in order to prevent some contamination from the animals. Minimize contamination from working animals. And so here, if somebody actually used horses or oxen or something to plow or cultivate, then they would need to take care if the animals were going to poop in the middle of the field, how they were going to deal with that. Maybe they set up the rows in such a way to try to minimize the possible contamination. There's been a lot of discussion in the Amish community, for instance, about how to deal with this. If you're using gloves, they need to be clean. And if they're not clean, they need to be cleaned or replaced. So just using gloves alone isn't going to solve anything. You can just have your hands. You don't have to have gloves. But if you do require gloves of people, they have to be kept clean. Remove or cover hand jewelry. Different kinds of things that might accidentally get into some kind of produce or whatever, or that might be themselves contaminated in some kind of way. People should put them in their pockets or leave them at home. And the exception to that is wedding rings. Do not eat, chew gum, or use tobacco in the produce areas. That's pretty straightforward. Usually in GAPS type things, you designate a particular area for people to eat in, for example, so that, they're not eating in produce areas. And then, excuse me, the workers need to wash their hands with soap and water and dry their hands with single-use items on a number of different occasions. Before they start work with produce, before they put on gloves, after they use the toilet, after they return to work, from some break, after they touch any animal or manure, and after they eat or smoke. So there's a lot of demands on the employer to basically educate the workers, and that includes the owners of the farm, about, when they have to do these things. This is why we recommend that people have farm food safety plans, right? Because you write down all these things and then you make provision for them, right? So that you make sure that you put the hand washing stations where they belong and teach people that they have to use them. Finally, they need to notify their supervisor if they're ill, as I mentioned before. A third thing in worker health and hygiene are the visitors that come onto the farm. In most GAPS kinds of things, you're obligated to meet these visitors when they come onto the farm and have them sign in. What FSMA requires is that you tell them what areas of the farm they're allowed to visit, that they shouldn't visit the farm if they're sick, and that they know what the policy of the farm is in terms of washing their hands, right? And so we just went through a whole list of things where people are obligated to wash their hands. And so the visitors, you would have to figure out, well, maybe they're not going to touch any animals, maybe they're not going to smoke, maybe they're not going to eat, but they need to know that if they do certain things, they're going to have to wash their hands, and they need to be told where they can do that. And they have to keep pets at home, service animals accepted, just like wedding bands. So again, the visitors must have access to toilet and hand washing facilities. And so that in addition to explaining to them your policies about hand washing and so forth, you have to tell them where those facilities are. They could be in a house, they could be a porta potty, whatever the case might be. But you should have to basically meet the visitors and explain these things to them. Then FSMA requires certain things of a wash station. You have to have water that has zero generic E. coli. So the water that you're using has to have been tested, and you have to have a test that proves it has zero generic E. coli. We're going to talk about water in general and the testing of water in the next webinar, so I'm not going to go into that now. But just to note that hand washing water is supposed to have zero generic E. coli. So, second, single-use paper towels, liquid soap, a gray water catchment, essentially something where the water can drip into when they're washing their hands, and a closed towel disposal. You'll see in the picture there's an orange bucket, which is the closed towel disposal. So this is actually required by the law, and so it's good to pay attention to that. Note that sanitizer gels of various sorts with different chemicals in them cannot be used as a replacement for washing hands with soap and water. And you want to explain why that is?
Hand sanitizer gels do not kill viruses. They only kill bacteria, and they only kill bacteria if hands are clean and not super cracked or filled with soil and different cracks and crevices. So a lot of times that just doesn't apply to farmer hands.
Okay. Let's see, what's the next one? All right, I think we're about done here with health and hygiene. So the toilet facilities on the farm have to be readily accessible. Do we have the section in here about OSHA requirements? Does that come later? Anyway, they're essentially the same requirements as OSHA does. You have to have the toilets available within a certain distance of the workers. And the toilet facilities cannot contaminate anything on the farm, so they can't be leaking. They need to be regularly cleaned. They have to provide for sanitary disposal of waste and toilet paper, so usually you have a service that pumps them out. And you have to have a hand washing station close to the toilet. On very small farms, you can use bathrooms inside houses. But if you're going to use porta potties, then they need to be serviced regularly. Sewage, if you can't be seeping somewhere. I mean, the people who are going to inspect these things are going to be looking for this. If they see any sewage of any kind that seems to be contaminating the ground, that's something that's considered egregious by FDA. And so these sewage systems have to be maintained to prevent contamination of the farm, whether it's a septic system or a regular sewage system. And any leak has to be dealt with. So you need a policy about, well, if you discover some leak from a porta potty or it overflows or whatever the case may be, how are you going to deal with that? And so again, this is a reason why people write down food safety plans. This is how I'm going to deal with this if I find it. And after significant natural events like floods, for instance, any kind of sewage system should be, checked to make sure that it's not leaking and causing contamination in some kind of way. Okay, back here to Katie.
And also, I just wanted to point out one other thing. In the right-hand sidebar under the handouts, if you click the little triangle on that, you'll see that there's a PDF titled Principal Obligations of Fully Covered Farms. That's the slides that we're going over today is in there. So if you wanted to download that for future reference, it's there for you. Also, this webinar is being recorded and we will be posting it on our website along with the PDF of the slides there as well. So there'll be documentation of this afterwards if you want to go back and reference anything. Okay, building, equipment, tools, and sanitation. So FSMA requires, well, we already talked about some of this when Dave talked about the different toilet and hand washing requirements, but additionally, there are parts in FSMA that say that you must use equipment and tools that are of adequate design and store them properly and maintain them clean and sanitize them when necessary. So this could apply to knives, like harvest knives in this picture, where we have a bin of clean harvest knives. That's a specific place where they go, so employees know when they're starting a new harvest that we, go and we pull the knives from the clean bin. Other ways you could apply this to if you are using tractors for some sort of partially mechanical harvest of crops. Maybe at a certain frequency, you check to make sure that they're not leaking any oil or hydraulic fluid or anything like that, so that you're making sure you use the equipment properly and you're not contaminating food potentially from using that equipment. One area that's important to think about is that seams on food contact surfaces must be smoothly bonded, which can be something that small growers don't necessarily think about because they might be doing some post-manufacturing edits to different machinery to modify it for their use that is different from the original manufactured use. So anything that has welds on it, and especially in corners, those are lovely breeding grounds for bacteria and pathogens. So that's an area where FSMA makes a mention to make sure you have smooth surfaces. If you use any thermometers or pH meters in your farm, in your packing area, or anywhere on your farm, you need to make sure that they're working properly. And then also make sure your buildings provide suitable conditions and drainage to reduce contamination of produce. So that could be, again, a lot of FSMA is not prescriptive. So you might be wondering, well, what does suitable conditions mean? And that depends on each unique circumstance. If it's just a 10 by 10 building, quote unquote building that has like a roof, but 4 posts mainly and no walls on it, suitable drainage and conditions for that would look a lot different than a fully enclosed 5,000 square foot packing shed. So it needs to be scale appropriate and based on the unique circumstances of the farm on how you interpret this. And then also to make sure to take reasonable measures to prevent contamination by domestic animals in fully enclosed buildings. So that would be probably just banning domestic animals from going into fully enclosed buildings. But if for some reason you were in the scenario that you had part of a enclosed building was where you had your goats live and then the other part was where you stored peppers or something, then you would need to make sure you had clear boundaries and didn't let the two cross-contaminate, and you'd have to document how you're doing that. Pest control is important, and especially in fully enclosed buildings, you must take measures to exclude pests. This could be through a variety of ways. You could make sure your shelves are not flush against the wall, that they're 6 inches off the wall. Excuse me, this allows for mice and rats prefer to have the tight quarters of the shelves pushed right up against the wall, but if you have that 6-inch gap there, they're less likely to want to be back there, along with if you had traps set or did any other kind of preventative excluding of pests. And then in partially enclosed buildings, you should take measures to prevent pests from being established. So a lot of that would just be based on observation. If you had birds all of a sudden coming up into your partially enclosed building and starting to roost in a corner of the the awning underneath the roof, then you would need to do something about that and make sure that they don't take up residence there, and maybe put up a bird net or those spiky bird repellent spikes. So those are kind of what that's getting at. And then also trash must be contained and disposed of. This is pretty straightforward. The basic introductory to food safety on farms is try and keep things as neat and orderly and clean as possible for a farm situation, and trash is a major part of that. And then for plumbing requirements, water system must be of adequate size and designed to distribute water properly. This gets at if you have any inline fertigation or chemical or pesticide application you're doing, you need to make sure you have backflow devices to prevent the contamination of your entire water source if something were to go wrong in the line. Okay, and now Dave's going to talk about harvest.
Okay, so FSMA requires essentially that you not harvest product that might be contaminated. So the example would be that there's feces on it from some animal, from a bird, whatever the case might be. So the workers have to be trained, the people doing the harvest have to be trained to know that if they encounter produce with feces on it, they are not to harvest that. And generally, you need to have decided what area around that you're not going to harvest, right? And so a lot of these gaps type things have rules about how big a circle you have to grow around it. The FDA does not prescribe any particular circle. It just sort of says you have to decide what is reasonably necessary to make sure that you're not harvesting produce that has feces on it or that's contaminated in some other way. You need to handle harvest produce to minimize contact of cut produce surfaces.
With the ground.
Oh, with the ground. Oh, we have a little thing on the right side of our screen here that is cutting off the end for me. So I didn't write that line. So essentially, if you were trimming lettuce in the field or trimming something else, you have to make sure that where you cut the zucchini or something, that cut surface doesn't touch the ground. Then you are not allowed to harvest drop produce. This comes from some incidents in the past, for instance, when dropped apples were used to make apple juice and made people sick. So FDA has decided that anything that is not normally growing on the ground or underground, like melons or isn't dropped on the ground purposely during the harvest, like almonds, that you're not allowed to harvest it. So you can't pick up fallen produce and sell it. Then finally, food packaging materials must be unlikely to support the growth of bacteria, either because you're using new boxes or because you clean them adequately. So for instance, in a CSA, you can clean a waxed paper box for some period of time, but at some point it needs to be thrown away. A lot of CSAs have gone to plastic boxes that are more readily cleaned. If you think you can get them back, that's probably a good idea. That was it.
Okay, and now we're on to the last topic we're going to talk about today, and that's record keeping. And it's actually only part of record keeping because I'm going to talk about the different records you need to keep for the topics we covered today, but then there will be other records that we will go over on the other topics in the future. So this is a table here with a lot in it, but it's a good consolidation of the records that are required for the topics we talked about today in one place. So for personnel training and worker health and hygiene, remember that I mentioned you need to have a record of the training that includes the date of the training, the topics covered, and the name and signature of the trainee. And then in this right-hand column here, it says that reviewed by supervisor, and some of them are yes and some of them are no. This is a topic that is yes, and what that means is certain records in FISMA, they need to be reviewed by a supervisor within a reasonable time after the record is created, and this helps put another check in the system of checks and balances to make sure that, say, all of the harvest foremen are responsible for training their crews on these topics, and then the harvest manager checks once a season or once every 4 months or something like that, whatever frequency is decided at the farm, to verify that the employees were trained by the foreman of each of the foremen. And then they would sign in and date that they reviewed that the record happened. So that's what that means by reviewed by supervisor. And there's also an asterisk there because the law did recognize that in some small farm situations, the person doing the training is the same person as the supervisor, so they don't need to re-review their own record and sign and date it a second time if that's the case. So for personnel training, as we mentioned, there's this PSA grower training that at least one current owner or employee needs to go to, and you will definitely keep that certificate they give you from that training on in your records, so you have that available, because that will certainly be one record that the inspectors, if you ever get inspected for FSMA, will want to see. And then in the building, tools, equipment, and sanitation categories, you'll want to have records of your cleaning, and if and when you sanitize your equipment that you use in harvesting, packing, or holding activities. Also, make sure you have toilet cleaning records, and if you have, say, a porta potty service outsourced to a different company, they already are pretty on top of making sure to leave this record inside of the door of the porta potty or wherever it may be. And then also, if you're doing this in-house, to make sure to create some sort of simple table like that you have employees fill out when they clean your bathroom area. And you might be wondering, how do I have a record of all the times I clean my, harvest bins or harvest knives? One way to go about this, on the CAF website, we have a Word doc that's a table, a one-page table, and it lets you, in the rows going down the side of the page, it has items such as harvest crates, harvest knives, harvest trucks, and different physical items, and then across the columns there's different frequencies of when you clean them. So you could just establish some routine of once a week, or on X and Y harvest days, like every Tuesday, Thursday when we're harvesting, or whatever makes sense for you, you would implement and then track that in some way by having the policy in your table of when you clean things, and then you could just have initials for when it happens. And then lastly, for harvest and traceability, it's important that you have a record of one step back and one step forward for all of your covered crops. And this can take a whole range of, this could be handwritten labels that go on boxes and then go out, and some farms might have electronic systems with barcodes to track where the red peppers went. If you have a farm management software that ties into your orders and also creates your daily harvest lists, and then you can link those to your invoices, that might be a way that you could already have traceability in place to be able to track where the red peppers, what field the red peppers came from, and where they went.
But it's not required to do it electronically.
Thank you, Dave. So if you didn't hear Dave there, he was mentioning that keeping track of your traceability is not required to be done electronically. That's an important point to make. So you don't need to be doing it that way. If you have a good paper system in place, then that's perfectly adequate as well. Okay, and then a few other details on record keeping. If you already have an existing record that fulfills the different criteria you need to meet for FSMA, you don't need to duplicate the record. So if you're already taking track of something for organic certification or whatever else, and you already have a record that's sufficient, then that's fine. Your records must be legible, and you must be able to provide them to FDA if they want to inspect you within 24 hours. They can be stored on-site or off-site, and you should keep all records for at least 2 years. and then they should be originals, or if they're electronic, they can be that way. Okay, so just kind of summing it up here for fully covered farms, some key points. Again, at least one supervisor or responsible party needs to go to the PSA grower training, and that link is earlier in the slideshow and in the handout and on our website. And also that farms need to evaluate what they're currently doing and then figure out what changes they need to make, because you might be doing a lot of this and just need to tweak things slightly or make a record of it. You have been doing the actions, but you didn't have any paperwork record of it, and that's a major part of food safety. Is if you don't have a record of it, it's as if you didn't do it. And then lastly, we'll cover water and manure and other biological amendments of animal origin and wildlife in the next webinar. And for now, just a quick note on this is that if farms are using manure, the FDA has said that you could use the NOP 90 to 120 day application windows until they announce anything different with their research that they're doing. So with that, it looks like we are getting close on time.
Would you recap where they can get the webinar and download the PDF and stuff? Can you say it again?
Right, so we have the question time right now, and you can, just a reminder, type in any questions in the side question bar on the right-hand side. And while I give you guys a minute to type in any questions, I just want to give you a reminder that you can download the slides that we just talked about today in the handout section of this sidebar. Also, they will be in the on the CAF website under the webinars tab, which is that link on like the third or fourth slide that we went over earlier in the presentation. They'll be there in a couple of days, as well as the full recording will be there as well. And we also just want to note from CAF that our hearts go out to everyone who's been affected by the fires in all the different parts of the state, and we are trying to help support growers in communities that have directly lost their farms. And there's information on if you are interested in donating to this cause on our website. So I don't see any questions coming in. Either Dave and I have totally just overwhelmed all of you, or maybe it's just a lot and you're still taking it in and don't have any questions. But maybe we'll just wait a few more seconds, but if not, then we will wrap it up here. And then feel free to email me at Kaylee, K-A-L-I, at caff.org, or you can learn a lot more on our website and the food safety program web pages on there at caff.org.
Yeah, and so tell them that you're available for direct assistance.
And if any of you are growers on the call or work with growers, please know that I'm available to provide free technical assistance and one-on-one support to growers throughout the state. And this can be in phone calls or emails or in-person site visits to farms, as well as we have a number of trainings, in-person trainings throughout the state this winter. There'll be about 20 plus trainings that we can meet in person, hopefully, and work out some of these details further, because it's a lot to take in, and farms have to navigate and figure out what parts of all these regulations actually apply to them and what changes they need to make. So I'm here to help you with that. So don't hesitate to reach out or recommend to growers to reach out. And it looks like we did get one question. So again, thank you for asking, where can I find more info on the first webinar? Let me go back to the full link here. That won't be too hard, I think. So right here on this, the webinar is online at this http www.caff.org/webinars. That is where
What's it called?
The first webinar titled FISMA in and out, is my farm subject to FISMA, and what do I need to do, is posted there. It's the one that happened on July 24th. There's actually another one, a webinar posted there too, and that's geared more towards organic growers, and it's a lot like the first webinar we did in this series, but just with more information for organic growers. So if you are wondering more about that, then you could watch the organic one. It'll cover all the same material and then more with the organic details. So hopefully this has been useful to you all and helpful, and thanks a lot for your time this afternoon, and keep an eye out for when we post the date and time for the third webinar in this series, when we talk about the water and wildlife and biological amendments of animal origin sections of what farms, fully covered farms under FSMA, need to do. All right, thank you. Have a good evening.